rain had stopped just before sunset, leaving the world smelling of wet cedar and dust. A long red glow lay stretched across the open Montana sky, and the horizon seemed endless. A lone wagon creaked its way toward the small church on the hill, its wheels sinking into the soft mud, and the sound of its wooden spokes echoed like a slow heartbeat through the empty valley. Inside sat a young woman named Clara May. Her hands rested tightly in her lap, her knuckles pale against the folds of her wedding dress. It wasn't a gown of silk or lace, but a simple cotton one, stitched by the women from town who whispered kind words, but hid their pity behind quiet eyes. She had no family left now. Her father's heart had given out that past spring, and the debts on their ranch had piled too high to count. The only reason the roof still stood above her was because a cowboy named Jack Callahan had offered to marry her. Jack wasn't a man she knew well. In fact, she'd spoken to him no more than a handful of times. He'd worked her father's land for a few seasons, fixing fences, rounding cattle, never asking for more than his pay. Folks said he was kind but distant, a man whose past was heavy with things he never spoke of. When her father died, Jack came to the funeral, hat in hand, quiet as always. A week later, when the banker came knocking, Jack made his offer. He said it plain and simple. "You don't need to lose your home, Clara. I can help if you'll let me." And now, here she was, in a dress that didn't fit quite right, about to become his wife. She didn't feel like a bride. She felt like someone walking into a life she didn't yet understand. The church looked small against the wide land, its steeple leaning slightly, its bell rusted silent. When the wagon stopped, Jack was already there waiting. He looked taller than she remembered, broad-shouldered, his face half hidden by the shadow of his hat. When she stepped down, he offered his hand, rough and warm, but she hesitated before taking it. He didn't seem to mind. The ceremony was short. The preacher spoke words that neither of them really heard. When it was done, Jack said, "I do," in that low, steady tone of his, and Clara repeated it with a tremor in her voice. The ring he gave her was simple silver, worn around the edges. When it slipped onto her finger, she felt the weight of everything that moment meant, not just the promise, but the survival tied to it. That night they rode together in silence back to the cabin that would now be theirs. The moon was full, silvering the grass and the fence lines. When they reached the porch, Jack helped her down again, his hand gentle but firm. "You'll be safe here," he said. That was all. She nodded, unsure what to say, and followed him inside. The cabin smelled of pine wood and tobacco. A small fire burned in the hearth, and the bed, her bed now, was neatly made, a wool blanket folded across the end. Jack set his hat on the table, ran a hand through his dark hair, and glanced her way. "You can take the room. I'll sleep out here by the fire if you'd like," he said. His voice was kind, but something inside her still trembled. She had never been alone with a man before. Never had someone looked at her with that quiet steadiness that felt both safe and terrifying. "I'm scared," she whispered suddenly, the words slipping out before she could stop them. He turned slowly. "What's that?" She looked down at her hands, twisting the silver ring. "It's my first night," she said softly. Her voice broke on the words. Jack didn't move for a long moment. Then he nodded, almost like he understood more than she'd said. "I know," he murmured. "You don't have to be afraid. Nothing's gonna happen that you don't want." But Clara didn't trust her own voice to reply. Her heart pounded in her chest. She had heard stories about wedding nights, some sweet, some cruel. She didn't know what kind of man he was yet. Slowly, her eyes went to the belt around his waist. Leather, worn, sturdy, the kind a working man used for years. Her hands moved before her thoughts could catch up. She stepped forward, trembling, and unbuckled it. The sound of the metal clasp releasing echoed faintly in the room. Jack froze. His breath caught, and his blue-gray eyes flicked to hers, questioning, startled. She placed the belt on the table beside his hat and said quietly, "You won't need this tonight." Her voice trembled, but her gaze stayed steady. "Please, not tonight." The silence that followed was long and thick. Then Jack took a slow breath and nodded. "All right," he said softly. He unbuttoned the cuffs of his shirt and rolled up his sleeves, not to intimidate, but to show he meant peace. He walked to the window, picked up his old rifle, and sat by the chair beside the fire. "You get some rest, Mrs. Callahan. I'll keep watch." She didn't move at first. She didn't know whether to feel relieved or ashamed. Slowly, she lay down on the bed, still wearing her dress. Her body shook as she pulled the blanket up to her chin, listening to the crackle of the fire and the steady rhythm of his boots as he crossed one leg over the other. He didn't look at her. He didn't say another word. Hours passed. The flames softened to embers, and the night grew quiet. Through the window came the sound of crickets and the distant cry of a coyote. Clara opened her eyes just enough to see him still sitting there, his hat tilted low over his eyes, his rifle resting across his lap, guarding her like a sentry. And for the first time since her father's death, she felt safe. When dawn broke, a line of gold light slipped through the cracks of the shutters. Jack was still there, half asleep but upright, his hat tipped back now, revealing a face softened by exhaustion. She sat up slowly, clutching the blanket. "You didn't sleep," she said quietly. He shrugged, a faint smile touching the corner of his mouth. "Didn't seem right to." "You looked peaceful for once." Her eyes stung unexpectedly. "You didn't have to do that." He looked at her for a long moment, then said, "Maybe not. But sometimes doing what you don't have to is what makes a man worth something." Then he stood, adjusted his hat, and went out to tend to the horses. That day, Clara walked outside for the first time as Mrs. Callahan. The land stretched before her, wide, wild, and alive. She watched Jack working in the fields, his shoulders moving with quiet strength, and something inside her began to shift. The fear that had gripped her heart started to loosen, replaced by a strange warmth she couldn't quite name. That night she found the courage to speak to him again over supper. "Why did you do it?" she asked, her voice small. "Why marry me when you could have walked away?" Jack looked down at his plate, then back up at her. "Your pa was a good man," he said simply. "He helped me when I had nothing. I reckon it's my turn to help someone else. But you didn't have to marry me for that," she said, her tone almost accusing. He smiled faintly. "Maybe I didn't, but a promise to protect means more when you're close enough to keep it." Clara didn't reply. She just watched him, the firelight catching the lines on his face, the small scar by his jaw that made him look both dangerous and gentle at once. She realized then that he wasn't a man of easy words, but every word he did say came from a place of truth. Days turned into weeks. The fear she carried began to fade. Sometimes she'd wake before dawn and find him already outside, saddling his horse, humming an old tune under his breath. Sometimes she'd leave a cup of coffee by the fire before he came in, and though he never said thank you, he'd always give a small nod that meant more than words. One night, she found him sitting on the porch, the same belt she'd taken off his waist, hanging loosely in his hands. "You kept it," he said, holding it up with a quiet grin. She blushed. "I didn't think you'd miss it." "Didn't," he said softly. "But I figured it meant something to you." "It did," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "That night when I took it off, I thought I was protecting myself. But now I realize you were protecting me all along." Jack's eyes lifted to hers, steady and kind. "Maybe we were both doing the same thing," he said. The wind blew across the prairie then, cool and gentle, carrying the scent of rain again. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was peaceful. Clara felt something open inside her chest, something like gratitude, something like love. That night, when she went to bed, she didn't whisper that she was scared. She didn't have to. Jack still sat by the fire for a while before turning in, and when he finally came to bed, he lay beside her with the same quiet respect he always had. There was no fear left, only trust, and in that small cabin beneath the wide Montana sky, two people who had started as strangers began to learn the truest kind of love, the kind that doesn't rush, doesn't demand, and doesn't need to be spoken to be real, for in that whisper of fear, something far stronger had taken root, the courage to trust again. The morning sun spread gold across the wide Montana valley, lighting the mist that still clung to the earth after the night's rain. Jack Callahan stood by the corral, tightening the saddle on his horse, while Clara watched from the porch. It had been 6 months since that quiet wedding night, the night she'd whispered she was scared and taken his belt, asking for peace instead of passion. In those months, the two had learned the rhythm of life together, slow, steady, unspoken. The fear that once gripped her had turned into something softer, something she didn't yet dare call love. She had learned the sound of his silence, the meaning of his nods, and the way his eyes always found her first when he returned from the fields. The ranch was beginning to breathe again. The soil, once cracked with neglect, now bloomed with fresh crops. The horses had grown strong, and so had she. There were days she found herself laughing at small things, burnt bread, runaway chickens, the way Jack cursed under his breath when the wind tore the laundry line loose. She hadn't laughed like that in years. And every time she did, Jack would glance over, just for a second, and smile, one of those rare smiles that started in his eyes before it reached his lips. But peace on the plains never lasted long. One afternoon, a storm rolled in sudden and mean. The sky went dark, thunder growled low, and the wind began to whip through the valley like a wild thing. The horses panicked, slamming against the fences. Jack shouted for Clara to stay inside, but she ran out anyway, rain slashing across her face, skirts clinging to her legs. She couldn't stand the thought of him out there alone. When she reached the barn, she saw him struggling to free a trapped colt caught under a fallen beam. Without thinking, she grabbed a pitchfork and tried to help, but lightning cracked close, too close, and the sound split the sky. The beam gave way, and in that blink of chaos, Jack pushed her aside. The crash was deafening. Clara fell hard onto the wet ground, the wind knocked out of her. When she looked up, Jack was on the ground beside the colt, the beam across his shoulder. His face was twisted with pain, rain pouring down his neck. "Jack!" she screamed, crawling toward him. He gritted his teeth, trying to lift it, but his strength faltered. Together, she braced against the mud, pushing with everything she had. The beam finally rolled off him, landing with a heavy thud. He slumped back, gasping, his shirt torn and blood seeping through the fabric. "Jack, please," she cried, her hands shaking as she tried to pull him up. He managed a small smile. "You sure don't listen, do you?" he said weakly. "Not when it comes to you," she whispered, tears mixing with the rain. It took nearly an hour to get him inside. She tore strips of cloth, cleaned the wound with trembling hands, and wrapped his shoulder as best she could. He tried to protest, but every time he opened his mouth, she silenced him with a firm look. "You saved me," she said softly, pressing her hand over his. Again. He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes clouded with exhaustion and something deeper. "That's what a husband's supposed to do," he murmured. She shook her head. "No, that's what a good man does." The days that followed were long. Jack's injury was worse than she'd feared. His right arm was nearly useless for weeks, and the chores fell to her. She milked, fed, mended, hauled water, things she'd never done alone before. And though her body ached, she did it gladly, because he had done the same for her once. Each night she would sit by his bedside, reading from her father's old Bible or humming softly until he drifted to sleep. Sometimes, when he woke in the middle of the night, he'd find her asleep in the chair beside him, her hand still resting on his. One night, as the fire burned low, Jack spoke without opening his eyes. "You ever wonder why I keep that old belt by the bed?" he asked. She blinked, surprised. "I thought you kept it because it's yours." He opened his eyes and looked at her. "It's more than that. That belt was my father's. He gave it to me the day I left home. Said a man's belt ain't just for holding his pants, it's for holding his life together. You keep your belt strong, you keep your word strong. You lose one, you lose the other." She reached over, running her fingers along the worn leather that hung over the chair. "Then why did you let me take it off you that night?" He smiled faintly. "Because for the first time in my life, I realized maybe it wasn't strength that held me together. It was trust. And that night, you needed to see you could trust me. Maybe I needed to see it too, the quiet stretch between them, warm and full. She felt her heart ache with gratitude and something deeper than she'd ever felt. She wanted to tell him how much that moment had changed her, how it had given her faith again, but her voice caught in her throat. So she just whispered, "Thank you." Weeks passed, and Jack's strength returned little by little. One morning, Clara woke to find him already outside, leaning on the fence, watching the sunrise. The belt hung around his waist again, and when she stepped out onto the porch, he turned and smiled. "Looks like I can do my own chores again," he said, testing his arm with a wince. She smiled, walking toward him. "You'll do them slow," she warned. He laughed softly. "Yes, ma'am." Then he added, "You did good while I was down. Better than good." "I had to," she said. "Someone's got to keep this place running." "Maybe," he said, looking at her in that way that made her forget to breathe. "But you did more than that, Clara. You kept me alive." Her throat tightened. "You'd have done the same," he nodded. "Maybe, but that's not the same as knowing someone would stay, no matter how bad it got." A breeze moved through the grass, carrying the smell of pine and wildflowers. Clara stood there, realizing that the man she'd married out of survival had somehow become the reason she wanted to live. She stepped closer, reaching for his hand, her fingers brushing against the leather of his belt. "I think," she said softly, "your father was right. A belt does hold a man's life together, but sometimes it takes someone else to remind him why it's worth holding on." Jack looked down at her hand on his, and for a moment he didn't speak. Then he reached up, cupped her cheek with his calloused palm, and said, "You're that someone, Clara." The days that followed were filled with quiet joy. They worked side by side in the fields, shared coffee on the porch before sunrise, and watched the sky turn gold every evening. The silence between them had changed. It wasn't born of fear anymore, but of understanding. One night, as the first snow began to fall outside, Clara found herself sitting by the fire, sewing a new strap from a piece of old leather. Jack watched her from his chair. "What's that for?" he asked. She smiled. "A new belt. The old one's worn thin," he chuckled. "Guess I've been holding life together a little too tight." She shook her head, threading the needle one last time. "No," she said softly. "You just held it long enough for me to help you carry it." When she finished, she handed him the new belt. It was simple, strong, and carved with small markings along the edges, tiny initials of both their names. Jack turned it over in his hands, his thumb tracing the letters. Then he buckled it around his waist, stood up, and reached for her hand. "Looks like this one's built to last," he said. "So are we," she replied. He pulled her close then, not with urgency, but with quiet certainty. The firelight danced across their faces, the sound of the wind whispering against the windows. She rested her head on his chest and listened to the steady beat of his heart, the same rhythm that had once stood guard by her bedside. For the first time, she realized they didn't just share a home or a name. They shared something far stronger, trust built from patience, from kindness, from love that asked for nothing but gave everything. Years later, folks around town would speak of Jack and Clara Callahan as the couple who turned a struggling ranch into a place of warmth and hope. They'd never talk much about how it began, but the people who visited always noticed the old, weathered belt hanging above the fireplace, a symbol of promises kept and fear overcome. And on quiet nights, when the wind rustled through the cottonwoods and the stars burned bright, Clara would look at it and smile, remembering that first night, the trembling words, and the man who chose gentleness over pride. She would whisper softly, "Thank you for waiting," because love, she had learned, was never about rushing or demanding. It was about listening, protecting, and believing that even the most frightened hearts could learn to trust again. And sometimes the strongest bond in the world began not with a kiss, but with a single act of kindness.